Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something kind of uncomfortable, maybe even a little bit squirm-inducing. We're going to be talking about shame.
Shame. Yeah.
But here's the thing, though.
Yeah.
We're not here to, bash shame or say it's always a bad thing.
Right.
What we're actually going to be doing is exploring how shame, even though we usually think of it as a negative emotion, might actually have some potential for good.
Yeah.
We're kind of flipping the script a little bit on shame.
Yeah.
And to help us do that, we're going to be looking at the work of an addiction psychiatrist.
Okay.
He actually uses a lot of patient stories to illustrate this idea, and he really digs deep into this complex emotion of shame. And what he finds is that while it can be definitely destructive, shame can also be a catalyst for some really positive change, especially when it comes to things like addiction and overconsumption.
That's interesting because I think, I've heard shame talked about a lot in my own work. And it's always as this really negative thing. And I think people don't really understand it, They just sort of have this idea oh, shame, that's bad, avoid it at all costs. But I think that there's something more to it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to it than that. And before we get into all of the, really fascinating stuff about how shame can be used for good, let's just take a step back and think about what shame actually is, right? How is it different from guilt?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of people kind of use guilt and shame interchangeably, but I think the author makes a really clear distinction between the two.
Yeah, he does.
And he says that, guilt is about feeling bad about a specific action. So I shouldn't have done that. Whereas shame is about feeling bad about yourself as a person. I am bad.
It's like guilt is I made a mistake, and shame is I am a mistake.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why shame can be so much more damaging, because it's not just about a specific behavior. It's about attacking your whole sense of self.
And he has this really interesting analogy where he compares guilt to what he calls an adaptive emotion.
Sure.
So guilt can actually be helpful in a way because it helps us learn and grow from our mistakes, right?
Right.
But shame, on the other hand, he calls that a maladaptive emotion because instead of helping us grow, it can actually trap us in these cycles of negativity and self-sabotage.
So guilt's kind of a little nudge in the right direction.
Yeah.
Whereas shame is this huge weight that's holding you down.
Exactly. And to illustrate this idea, he introduces us to this patient, Lori, who's struggling with addiction and overconsumption. And what's really interesting about her story is that she's part of this very tight-knit church community, but she's so terrified of letting anyone in that community see this part of her, this struggle that she's dealing with.
Yeah, and you can really see how this destructive shame is at play in her story, right? Because she's so afraid of being judged or rejected that she ends up hiding her overconsumption from the people who could actually help her.
Right.
And this is what creates that vicious cycle, The more she overconsumes, the more shame she feels, the more she hides it, and it just keeps going.
Yeah, and that isolation just ends up feeding the addiction,
Yeah.
right? So it's just this downward spiral. And the author actually shares that, things got so bad for Lori that she even contemplated suicide because the weight of that shame felt so unbearable.
That's really sad. And it just shows how powerful shame can be when it takes control, and how dangerous it can be.
It's a really powerful example of that. But thankfully, he doesn't leave us there. He goes on to introduce this really interesting concept called prosocial shame, which is kind of mind-blowing when you first hear it.
Yeah, prosocial shame. It's how can shame, something that we think of as being so negative, actually be good for us?
Right. But that's the thing. He's saying that
Yeah.
it can be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically the opposite of what we saw with Lori, right? So instead of hiding your flaws, it's about being open about them with a supportive community. It's about vulnerability and accountability, not judgment and rejection.
So it's kind of like turning that shame outward instead of inward.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he shares a story about his own mentor. And his mentor struggled with alcoholism for years, but eventually found the strength to overcome it through his experience with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA.
AA?
And so what's really interesting is that he talks about how the structure of AA itself actually really taps into this idea of prosocial shame.
How so?
Well, there's this big emphasis on honesty and accountability, right? You go to these meetings, you share your story, you hear other people's stories, and you're held accountable by the group. And that creates this really safe space for people to confront their addiction and to start to heal.
So instead of feeling ashamed and hiding, they're actually using that shame to connect with others and to get support.
Exactly. And the author actually brings in some economic theory to explain how this works. He talks about this concept called club goods, which are basically benefits that you can only access if you're part of a certain group.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So in the context of AA, the club goods would be things like the support, the shared experience, the sense of belonging that you get from being a part of that community.
Yeah.
But you only get access to those benefits if you're actively participating, if you're being honest, if you're adhering to the group's norms.
So it's kind of like a built-in incentive to stay engaged in the recovery process.
Exactly. You don't want to lose access to those club goods. And to show how this plays out in real life, he shares the story of this woman, Joan, who was a recovering alcoholic who unfortunately relapsed. But because she was part of this AA community, she had a sponsor who held her accountable. And even though it might be uncomfortable in the moment, that accountability can actually be the thing that helps you get back on track.
Yeah, it's not about punishment. It's about having that safety net, that support system to help you stay committed to your goals.
Right. And so we've seen how this idea of prosocial shame works in the context of addiction recovery. But the author goes on to argue that these same principles can be applied to all sorts of other areas of life, even something like parenting.
Parenting. I'm intrigued.
And he uses this really endearing story to illustrate this point. He talks about how one time he accidentally ate his children's Easter chocolate bunnies.
Oh, no! The classic parenting blunder.
And of course, like many of us would probably do, he initially lied about it, but then he thought about it and he decided to confess to his children.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So he chose to be radically honest, even though it was probably really uncomfortable.
Yeah, and he says that that act of confessing, even for something that seems so small, is actually incredibly powerful.
How so?
Well, he was basically modeling for his kids the importance of owning up to your mistakes, right, and seeking forgiveness. He wasn't afraid to show them that even parents aren't perfect.
I love that. And I think that's such an important lesson for kids to learn because so often we try to present this image of perfection to our kids. And I think it can be really damaging for them.
Yeah, and it can make it harder for them to be honest with us about their own struggles, right?
Exactly. So by being vulnerable and showing our kids that it's okay to make mistakes, we can actually create a much stronger foundation for trust and connection in our families.
Exactly. And he also briefly mentions this other parenting experience that touches on this idea. He talks about how his daughter, it turned out, didn't have a natural talent for music. And so he realized that pushing her to pursue music would only lead to frustration and disappointment for both of them. So instead, he encouraged her to explore her own strengths and interests, even if they weren't what he had initially hoped for.
That's really beautiful. It's about accepting our children for who they are, not who we want them to be.
Right. And I think that acceptance, that willingness to let go of our expectations, is a really crucial aspect of this whole idea of prosocial shame. It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be themselves, flaws and all.
And that leads us to a bigger point that the author makes about finding balance in our lives. Because I think we live in a culture that's obsessed with achievement and perfection. We're constantly bombarded with these messages about being successful, about being the best, about having it all. And I think that constant striving can lead to a lot of stress and anxiety, and it can make us feel like we're never enough.
Yeah, and the author actually uses the example of this patient named Mohammed who was struggling with cannabis addiction. And he thought that nature would be the answer, right? Like he would go out into nature to try to escape his problems. But initially, those attempts to find peace in nature were actually fueled by avoidance and denial.
So he was basically just trying to numb himself and avoid facing his issues.
Exactly. But then something shifted, and he started to engage with nature in a more mindful way. So he was really present in the moment. And that's when he started to find true escape. Not escape from the world, but escape from his addiction.
That's so powerful. So it's like he's saying that true freedom comes not from running away from our challenges, but from facing them head on with this mindful awareness and acceptance.
Exactly. And it all ties back to this idea of prosocial shame. So instead of trying to hide our flaws and seeking solace in avoidance, maybe we can actually find true connection and healing by embracing our imperfections within a supportive community.
It's such a counterintuitive idea, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah, and it really challenges us to think differently about shame and its role in our lives. And so that brings us to the conclusion of this part of our deep dive. And in the next part, we're going to continue exploring the author's insights into shame and how we can harness its power for positive change.
And in the next part, yeah, we're going to be talking about how we can actually use shame to like heal and grow and find more balance in our lives. It's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is. So to start off, he talks about how, we've been talking of this culture of achievement and perfection. And he actually challenges this conventional idea of recovery. He says it's not just about abstaining from harmful things or behaviors, but it's actually about like rewiring your brain.
Rewiring your brain.
Yeah, to find pleasure in simpler things.
Okay.
So instead of, chasing after all these intense highs, whether they come from substances or, technology or even achievements, it's about finding fulfillment in like the ordinary moments of life.
Right, right. So it's about like shifting your focus
Yeah.
from like the big things to the smaller things.
Yeah, exactly. And he actually uses Muhammad's story to kind of illustrate this concept of self-binding. So remember how Muhammad was trying to like limit his cannabis use on his own, but he kept relapsing. And it was only when he really immersed himself in nature in this mindful way that he was able to actually break free.
So sometimes we need to create those external structures or find those supportive communities to help us navigate those challenges. Like we can't always go it alone.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of prosocial shame comes full circle,
Yeah.
right? It's about intentionally finding those safe spaces where we can be honest about our struggles
Right.
and receive support and guidance and accountability without that fear of being judged.
So like AA is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, exactly. And the author also offers some really practical tips for how we can create that sense of balance in our lives.
Yeah.
He talks about things like meditation and mindfulness can help us kind of reset our nervous systems and find some peace in the midst of all the chaos. But he also cautions against something that might sound a little bit counterintuitive. He talked about getting addicted to pain.
Addicted to pain. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so he's not saying that, we should go out and seek out pain. But what he's saying is that sometimes we become so accustomed to our suffering that we kind of unconsciously cling to it. Like we find comfort in our misery because it's familiar.
Oh, I see. I see. So it's kind of like that saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's encouraging us to become more aware of those patterns,
Yeah.
to challenge that tendency to hold on to negativity. And he actually believes that radical honesty, both with ourselves and with other people, is really crucial for breaking free from those cycles.
It's about shining a light on those dark corners and being willing to face those difficult truths.
Exactly. And ultimately, he argues that prosocial shame is like this powerful antidote to the narcissism and isolation that we see so much of in our society today.
That's interesting. How does prosocial shame combat those things?
Well, he says that prosocial shame actually affirms our belonging to the human tribe. So by acknowledging our imperfections, we realize that we're not alone, right? We all have flaws. We all make mistakes. And we all need support and connection.
So it's about recognizing that shared humanity, that common ground that we all share.
Exactly. And so by creating spaces where honesty and vulnerability are met with acceptance, not judgment, we can foster this sense of community and belonging that helps us all thrive.
And that's a really powerful idea. And I think that leads perfectly into, the conclusion of the chapter. He talks about how, instead of running away from the world, we can find escape by immersing ourselves in it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image.
It is.
But what does that actually look like in a practical sense, right? Like what are some takeaways from all of this?
Well, I think first and foremost, the author is challenging us to really reconsider our relationship with shame. Instead of seeing it as something to be avoided at all costs, maybe we can explore how it might actually be leveraged as a force for good.
He's definitely not saying that we should, use shame as a form of punishment or control or anything like that. It's about creating this culture of radical honesty and accountability
Right.
within supportive communities.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And that by sharing our struggles and supporting each other, we can overcome even the most difficult challenges.
And I think on a personal level, he's also encouraging us to just cultivate more mindful awareness in our lives.
Yeah.
To pay attention to our own patterns, be honest with ourselves and with others, and seek out those spaces where we can be truly seen and accepted.
It's a reminder that true connection and healing, they come from embracing our imperfections, both within ourselves and within our communities.
And it all starts with just being willing to step outside of our comfort zones, be vulnerable, and ask for help when we need it.
Absolutely. And, as the author points out, the rewards of finding and maintaining balance in our lives are so worth the effort. It's a journey that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to embrace the messy, imperfect reality of being human.
And speaking of messy and imperfect, one of the things that I really love about this chapter is how the author weaves in those personal anecdotes.
Oh, yeah. He's so good at that.
Yeah, he talks about, eating his kid's Easter chocolate and his daughter's lack of musical talent. And he even admits to struggling with his own addictive tendencies at times.
Right. And I think that's what makes him so relatable. It's not just some expert, preaching from on high.
Right.
He's sharing his own struggles and triumphs, which makes his insights so much more powerful.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, look, I'm not perfect. I mess up too, but I'm learning and growing, and so can you.
And that message of hope is really what makes this whole exploration so valuable. It's a reminder that we all have the capacity for growth and transformation, no matter how challenging our circumstances may be.
It's really inspiring. And, this makes me think back to Lori, that patient who was struggling with addiction and overconsumption. We kind of left off with her, feeling really isolated and rejected by her church group.
Yeah.
Did she eventually find a path to recovery?
She did, yeah. After that experience with her church group, she was really hesitant to try AA. She felt like she already had her church. But, a few months later, she decided to give it a try.
And what happened?
Well, she found exactly what she was looking for, She found the supportive community where she could be honest about her struggles without fear of judgment.
Yeah. It's amazing how powerful it can be to just hear other people's stories and realize that you're not alone in your struggles.
It really is. And in Lori's own words, she said, "The relief I felt letting go of my deepest, darkest secrets, seeing the hope in newcomers' eyes. I was so isolated before. I remember just wanting to die. Lying awake at night, whipping myself for all the things I'd done. In AA, I learned to accept myself and other people for who they are. Now I have real relationships with people. I belong. They know the real me."
Wow. That's so powerful. It really highlights the power of prosocial shame to create that space for healing and connection.
It does, and it reminds us that we don't have to go through life alone,
Yeah.
There are people out there who understand what we're going through, and they're ready to walk alongside us on the path to recovery.
And now this leads us to another really fascinating aspect of the chapter,
Yeah.
where the author starts to explore how these principles of prosocial shame can be applied beyond the realm of addiction. And he shares this really compelling example from his own family life.
Are you talking about the story about his kids' swim team?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So apparently, his kid's swim coach, who secretly had a PhD in behavioral economics, had created this whole system of strict rules and rituals for the team.
Yeah, I remember that. Mandatory attendance at practice, specific dress codes for different days of the week, a total ban on cell phones at meets. It seemed a little bit much at first glance.
It did.
Mm,
But the author noticed something really interesting. The kids actually loved it.
they did.
They thrived under this structure.
Mm.
And he realized that the coach was brilliantly leveraging these principles of prosocial shame to create this strong sense of community and commitment within the team.
So those strict rules and rituals were actually acting as club goods.
Exactly.
Oh.
The kids were willing to follow those norms because they didn't want to lose access to the benefits of belonging to that team.
That's really fascinating. So it sounds like he's suggesting that we can apply these principles to other areas of life too, like
Right.
parenting, education, even workplaces.
It's about creating environments where people feel a sense of belonging and purpose and accountability.
Yeah.
And it's not about being controlling or authoritarian. It's about finding creative ways to foster connection and commitment and a shared sense of values. This deep dive has been full of surprises. Who knew that shame, something that we usually try to avoid, could actually be a key to personal growth and positive change?
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, and that even the most seemingly negative emotions can have a surprising flip side. Which makes you wonder, what other seemingly negative emotions or experiences might hold this hidden potential for growth and transformation?
That's a great question. And it leads us perfectly into our outro, where we want to leave our listeners with a final provocative thought to ponder.
Yeah, and I think it's really about, taking what we've learned about prosocial shame and seeing if we can apply it to our own lives.
Exactly. So to our listeners, we leave you with this. What would it take to create those kinds of spaces in your own lives?
Where can you find or even build communities that actually embrace vulnerability and accountability as pathways to growth and connection?
And how can you, in your own interactions with other people, cultivate an attitude of acceptance and empathy rather than judgment and shame?
These are tough questions, but I think they're really important ones to consider, because the answers might just surprise you.
And that wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of shame and its surprising potential for good. We'll see you next time for another fascinating journey into the depths of knowledge.